Greetings, I'm your host, Jason Myles, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. For all the returning listeners and subscribers, thank you for coming back. To those new to the channel, thank you for taking a moment to check us out. If you dig what we're doing, please hit like and, of course, the subscribe. That goes a long way in promoting the channel. No TIR fam with me tonight in the main show. Toussaint will be joining me in the champagne room as we will take a deep dive into the recent Cat Williams Shannon Sharpe interview. I really look forward to watching that with you guys. That was all the chatter in the TIR group chat, with the Quintern sending a WTF message. What the hell is going on with Cat Williams? He said, this feels like an assault. So that'll be going on in the champagne room later. But now for the main show, I see you guys already talking about it in the chat. We're going to talk a little bit about decolonization with our good friend, my good friend, returning guest. This is from his most recent piece that he co-wrote in his Substack. To the extent that decolonization endorses a particular political message, the field manufactures consent by imposing implicit acceptance of the narrative over an entire network of publishers, scholars, institutes, students, and administrators. To push against this is by no means a claim that Russia is innocent or justified to invade another country, to seize its assets is egregious. But to view this conflict through a materialist lens with history in mind clarifies a different set of factors and complicates the dominant civilizationist narratives in the West, democracy versus autocracy, as well as the nationalist narratives that prevail and are reinforced in the academy, whether it be the Russian claim to protect ethnic Russians in Ukraine or Ukraine's specific narrative of national sovereignty and exclusive nationhood. Such narratives eclipse how the layered economic, political, and territorial crises unleashed by the dismemberment of the USSR within US-led globalization shaped the conflict. That, again, is a quote from our guest's latest piece, The Poverty of Decolonization. It goes into their opinion that decolonization isn't applicable to Slavic studies. Please welcome returning show guest, author, and my good friend, Alexander Herbert.
The applause is really humbling. I've never been introduced to such an applause before.
You know why? Because you've never done a speaking engagement with me.
It's true. That is very true.
Can we set something up in New England?
Yeah, and I come to the West Coast at least once a year, so it was option two. I want to go back to Mexico too. I actually want to live in Mexico.
There's a lot of, when you come back, this next time when you come back, we'll go south because you guys went to TJ. We'll go south to Ensenada. It's one of the most beautiful drives that you'll make in North America. I promise.
I believe it. I'll be back. I'll definitely be back. It was fun.
I had a ball with you guys here. You guys and all your dietary restrictions.
We made it work. You got laughed at by many a Mexican chef too. But it was worth it.
You're a what? They were like, no cheese at all?
Yeah.
So in your piece, let's get back to the seriousness at hand. And I have a feeling we're going to have some viewers and some comments because you guys definitely talk about the Soviet Union. But you guys took on kind of a whole field, a whole school of thought in this piece. I'm assuming because you were at this recent conference. Is it ASS? What is it again?
ACES, ASEEES, Association of Slavic, Eastern European, and Eurasian Studies.
I do feel kind of bad Kuba's not here, but he's a political science guy, not necessarily a Slavic studies guy. What prompted you to write this piece? Did you have such a horrible time at the conference, or is that quite the contrary?
I had a blast, actually. I mean, I've been to ACs many times. It's like it's the institution, the event for people who study the post-socialist world more broadly, post-Soviet world more broadly, history, anthropology, literature, sociology, political science, economy, etc. All the people, they come to ACES to workshop their new projects, to meet their colleagues, to work out new book ideas, everything. And it's huge. I mean, there are I was told around 2,000 people that participated, over 200 different panels and roundtables. It's a giant endeavor. It's usually held in one of the major hotels in a downtown city. This year it was Philadelphia. Last year it was Chicago. Next year it's going to be Boston. It was in New Orleans one year and Cisco in another. But it's huge is what I'm trying to say. And so it is a fun kind of thing to do. You go, and for me, I meet up with people that I went to graduate school and I listen to what they're working on. But then it's also the opportunity to go and provide some critique to others' work and some field in a cordial way. Because we don't want to be, don't want to enter into a screaming match while we're there, because, professionalism and all that, which is fine. And so me, Brian, my co-author, who unfortunately isn't with us, although he lives in Tbilisi, Georgia, so his time zone is
it's a different day, and it's like early in the morning. It would look, if he would have been able to make it, it would have been a hell of a get, but he's here in spirit.
Yeah, he also does the Reimagining Soviet Georgia podcast. I'll shout all that out at the end. But in any case, we were there, and we are Marxists, as as I'm sure you all can tell by my beautiful picture of Marx here.
I thought you were going to say by your sweater.
Maybe by my sweater too. And so we were there, and we went to these different panels and roundtables, and we would meet up afterwards, because sometimes we went to different ones, and every hour there's like 20 going on. And so I would usually go to the panels that were on environmental history and political economy, and Brian went to the ones that were about nation building and memory, etc. And so we would meet afterwards, and we would like rip these panels and panelists apart. Not because like we don't trust their scholarship or anything, but because we thought that the level of analysis that they were applying was not only kind of essentialist, but it was also heavily politicized. And so the theme of this year's ACES conference was decolonization, which already we were kind of skeptical of, because you can look at the program of the panels and what they're all titled and who's presenting. And one thing that immediately stood out was that none of these scholars of the post-Soviet world are engaging with post-colonial scholars or the theory of decolonization from, Africa or South America or Asia or wherever you are. The places that created post-colonial theory were sort of absent here, right?
And so this wasn't about Africa. This wasn't about the Americas. This was totally about just Slavic nations and the USSR project.
So the decolonization theme came, of course, from Russia's escalation of its conflict with Ukraine, and the urging of people in our field to decolonize the field, and the assumption that since forever attention has been disproportionately placed on Russia at the expense of the other Soviet peoples, like Ukraine, not just Ukraine, but also Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, the Baltics, et cetera, et cetera. That's a fair invitation, to say, let's decenter Russia and look at the other republics that's fine. We accept that. But what we saw was that when some of these scholars would write, theorize about the creation of the Ukrainian nation, or the history of the Georgian nation, and yada yada, a lot of it were taking these sort of essentialist positions of what constitutes a nation in terms of abstract ideology, and not in terms of what materially constitutes a nation. And so what we wanted to do was to kind of dial back this cultural, what we called it cultural analysis. It's cultural history, which I can also get into what that means. Dial back this cultural history to look at, well, what does it mean if we kind of essentialize the nation state, or the nation, what it means to be a national, as opposed to applying a material analysis to the basis of national claims. So, one example that I sort of gave in a cheeky way in the article is, there's been plenty of books and articles about, borscht as a Ukrainian dish that embodies the Ukrainian nationality or Ukrainian nationhood. And, really, borscht as this sort of abstract food is what embodies Ukrainian nationhood. I think that, you sort of get these arguments and you roll with them, where like a material analysis of borscht as it constitutes Ukrainian nation would look at something like the political economy of agricultural production in Ukraine, as opposed to, Russia or any other place that claims borscht as its national dish. Trade within Ukraine, and how that facilitated certain agricultural practices within Ukraine. You can look at class analysis within a place like Ukraine. So applying a more rigorous material analysis to what constitutes the basis of a nation state is what we were asking for from the field. And it's not like we made this up out of nowhere. The urging to do this, the call to do this for us, for Brian and I, came very much from reading the theories of decolonization, post-colonial theory. If you read someone like Kwame Nkrumah, for example, the entire basis of his, not just Ghanaian nationalism, but Pan-Africanism, is based on a material understanding of African resources, of Africa's relationship to the IMF and the World Bank, or Ghana's relationship to the IMF and the World Bank. And so we wanted to introduce these kind of material factors into the study of post-socialist decolonizing moments, because to not do so, right, to admit the material aspect of it is implicitly aiding in the American rewriting of those post-socialist narratives. Because once you start digging into material analysis, you look at things like privatization, you look at the role of the IMF in places like the Baltics. NATO comes up, right, as a major source of funding. And so it starts to challenge this dominant cultural perspective that, Putin is Hitler incarnate, and Russians are bad, right? Russians are all guilty by association. These broad cultural claims that aren't rooted in materiality, they have political implications, not just for policymakers in Washington, but the ways that Americans and Westerners see and understand Russia or Ukraine or the Baltics or wherever.
I mean, how do you think, as a person that does, you teach, how do you think Americans understand currently Russia? Do you think Americans are still stuck in kind of a Cold War vision of the USSR and see Putin as some sort of return to Stalinism?
I think that, again, to go on this historiographical plane that we were arguing, one of the criticisms that came up is that, we didn't cite Soviet Marxist literature in our writing, Soviet materialist Marxist historians, and therefore, our argument is discredited. But again, we weren't making that argument about their relevance. We were making the argument about its political implication today. And so that Cold War position, right? The position, and even if I did cite, any Soviet era economist, materialist, the sort of reflexive response of the American and Western academics is to say, well, those numbers are inflated. We can't really trust them. The Soviets always doctored their numbers, and it's unreliable information. So why even bother citing them? And what we wanted to say was that Cold War mentality of discrediting Soviet scholarship on a systemic level in the academy exists even today. And so when you look at something like Putin and his popularity, it's a fact that he is very popular in Russia. And, America say, well, he doctors the elections and he rigs them, and that's why he's so popular. Maybe he does do some work to eliminate opposition. I'm not going to doubt that. But does he change the electoral numbers in his elections? No, he is immensely popular. He has been in the past elections. It's just that 80% approval rating in the United States is unheard of. So then, of course, it must be corrupt. If Putin has 80% approval rating, of course it can't be real, because God forbid any American president ever be approved to that level. But when you study again the material basis of Putin and who Putin is, go back to the materialism of it, you can see that from 2000, from the end of the 1990s to today, Putin has rebuilt Russia into not just an economic power, not just a military power, but as a reputable power in this emerging multipolar world. It wouldn't have happened without Putin.
Was your piece, or were you being viewed as defenders of Putin?
I wouldn't say, we don't, again, we're not coming down on whether we support or don't support Putin. And I'm not really prepared to say that. I will say that, we can recognize his popularity, for one, as objectively true. For two, we can recognize that he has built the Russian Federation into what it is, in comparison to Yeltsin, right? Yeltsin was sort of a puppet for the West. He was always drunk. He was a shame for Russians internationally. And Putin has sort of reclaimed that greatness, that identity that Russians had lost after 1990. So we will say that. But more importantly, what we want to say is that, whether you support Putin or not, or whether you're pro-Ukraine or not, go back to the materialism of what happened in 1990. Go back to the privatization of these states. A colleague of mine, a friend of mine, Sopo, who also does the Reimagining Soviet Georgia podcast, just published an article in Jacobin on the disappearance of healthcare in Georgia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and how Georgian healthcare is sort of in shambles right now because of what happened there, because of the privatization of healthcare. So go back to these material, not just causes, but effects, and then make your political judgments on whether Putin is Hitler incarnate based on that, or whether it'll give you a sort of more sympathetic understanding of Russia's position vis-a-vis NATO, Russia's position in Ukraine, Russia's position in opposition to American hegemony, etc.
Tell me how you really feel.
I feel like I feel like I'm not even getting to the heart of it. I feel like if Brian were here, he's the real historian of
Last
nation
I
and memory.
checked, you have a few pieces of paper that say you can speak on this stuff. So,
It's true. I could say something.
and you've lived there and you speak the language. So I feel extremely confident with you in the driver's seat. Now, have you guys faced any praise or criticism? If so, where did the praise come from? And if there was any backlash, what was the backlash saying? Let's start with the bright side. Have you guys had any positive comments?
So, as a piece that kind of puts an entire field on blast, on the spot, and is sort of, the piece begins with describing what ACES is in order to set up the reader to kind of dig into the implications of this whole decolonizing, the political implications of this whole decolonizing move. We wanted the piece to circulate amongst academics, particularly people that were at ACES and who could speak on their own experience of it. And the positive feedback has been from mostly younger scholars who have said things like, you guys, thank you for saying this. You're putting into words things that I've wanted to say for a long time, but haven't known how to say it. And other forms of praise that have been really good and humbling. And everybody will say, this is really great. This is an awesome interjection into the historiography. It's a real probing invitation for scholars to reconceptualize and reintroduce materialism. Even though I might have a few disagreements, they don't matter, but they still appreciate the effort. Mostly because, not just the political implications of our argument, but the sort of institutional implications of our argument is that I don't know how many listeners have gone to graduate school for this kind of stuff, but when you do, you have to pass what are called qualifying exams, right? And qualifying exams, for some people who might not know, it's typically 3 fields. So for me, for example, it was modern Russia, modern Europe, and environmental history. And so you have these 3 fields. You create reading lists that are around 100 books for each field, and then you are to be tested on each reading list. This is how you learn the historiography, the major arguments that are in the field, in the history, et cetera, et cetera. And so part of what we were also arguing is that it's in that process that these culturally essentialist narratives are sort of reified and kind of instilled into emerging Western academics. So that, it's easier to kind of blend in than it is to deviate from what's been written already, if that makes sense. And so to hear from other scholars that, like, I've felt this way, but I don't know I haven't known how to say it, has been really encouraging, I think, for both Brian and I. Now, the bad stuff, I mentioned one already. There was somebody that said that we didn't cite Soviet economists, and so that was to the detriment of our argument, this person said, which I think is kind of missing the point, because again, we weren't making a historical argument, we're making a historiographical argument. It's 2 different things. There's no need to cite a Soviet era economist, as this person says. A lot of the pushback that we got hasn't really been substantive at all. There's one character who's a sort of notorious liberal on Twitter in this field who, said that he has some fundamental disagreements and he'll hit us with a bigger response later. And I don't actually expect him to hit us with a bigger response.
You're getting an email, brother.
Yeah. Probably not. I mean, because again, our argument, because we're calling out the political implications of this historiography, is political. And it is implying in certain ways that maybe we should dig deeper into what's going on in Ukraine and not just apply these essentialist narratives to it about, you know, whether that's on the left, Ukraine being Nazis and therefore all bad, or whether it's on in the sort of center liberal narrative, which is Putin is a monster and Russians are oppressed and all that. You know, those are not substantive material views of the crisis, and so that is a political argument. And so there are people that, of course, inherently are against that, and they just want to believe, and they just want to promote this narrative that that Putin is bad and Zelensky is the poor, you know, poor sufferer.
There's a funny comment. I'm going to send a bigger response later. Is the NBA hold me back of history?
It is.
For that. You actually talk about kind of more of the materialist conditions that would cause, I almost said the Soviet Union, that would cause Russia to even want to invade Ukraine. And you started way further back than 2014, 2013. You're talking more about, you started around 1990, I believe, because you're talking about material resources such as trade routes and oil.
I'll try to do justice to this part because, you know, this is where Brian and I's brain together really came out.
Voltron it.
Yeah, we formed like a fucking Power Ranger when it came to
You can see the age differences in me and Alex because he said Voltron, he said Power Ranger.
Because I'm an environmental historian, right? So I understand the world in terms of political economy, natural resources, and climate change. And so when I look at geopolitics, I'm always looking at, well, where's the oil, or where's the lithium, or you know, where's the gold, where are the resources, and why is this happening according to that? And so for my analysis of, you know, this crisis in Ukraine is, of course, that the Soviet Union throughout the 1970s and 80s built a very robust and extensive oil and natural gas infrastructure, because that's what it was sort of pegging its economy to. And so when 1990 happened, the border of the Soviet Union collapsed and it broke into multiple borders, right? And so all of these new deals had to be made between Russia and the countries in which pipelines are passing through. Not just pipelines, but also, you know, some people might already know about, you know, Russia's guaranteed access to the Black Sea with, you know, through Ukraine that happened after 1990. All these deals that at that time in 1990, yes, climate change is sort of is being discussed, but it's not as, you know, Verso isn't yet publishing 100 books a year on climate change, or however many they do now. I like to make that joke because I feel like it's all Verso talks about now, for good reason, I guess. You know, they had that one book about Foucault and acid and environment, I think. I don't remember. But anyway.
Yeah, some of those sound like I will make those comments off air.
But anyway, respect for Verso. I have plenty of Verso books, and I love Andreas.
I just talked to a guy that gets published on Verso earlier today. I had a conversation with Cedric Johnson about something I'm writing. I was picking his brain earlier today.
Yeah, mad respect for Verso. I like him a
lot. Ray Reed is published on Verso, so props to Verso. So that being said, some of those titles.
It's true. You know, I've had people invite me to like make a book pitch to Verso, and they give me like specific guidelines of like, you know, if you refer to this theorist, then they're definitely going to take it. And I'm like, I don't want to try to fit that in. But in any case, so I understand this stuff environmentally, and so I'm looking at the breakup of the Soviet Union through these sort of resource deals. And as you go from 1990 to 2020, 2019, it's increasingly obvious that states are aware of the reality of resource scarcity, of the future that climate change has for us, and therefore the imperative to secure access to unfettered access to natural resources, whether that is Russia clamping down on its its access to oil and gas within Russia itself, or clamping down on potential threats to its oil and gas trade vis-a-vis a place like Ukraine. Now, on the other hand, that's the environmental aspect. Brian is much more interested in the construction of the nation and of memory politics, and how and you have to understand these things are related, right? So if environmental politics are political, of course, and states make actions according to how they can achieve access to these natural resources, the same should be said about how it inculcates a sense of nationality and nation building in the process of doing that. And so, for example, in the case of Ukraine, in 1990, there's this massive push led by the United States to not just privatize the Ukrainian economy, but also to rewrite and re-educate the Ukrainian people. And so I actually have a colleague of mine that is working on a dissertation about this, about Ukrainian diaspora in Canada and in the US. These are people that came to Canada in the US in the 1970s, mostly dissidents who became academics. And so thus started writing histories of the Ukrainian nation and such. In 1990, these people are invited back to a newly post-Soviet Ukraine, and they are tasked with rewriting the textbooks to reflect Ukraine's national identity, new national identity. You got to understand that Ukrainian national identity is always and necessarily has to be in opposition to not just Russia, but now in opposition to the Soviet Union. So you get this massive endeavor of rewriting history, right? And so, you know, in Georgia is the case that there are younger people that refer to Soviet Georgia as the Soviet occupation of Georgia. It's sort of, it's an example of rewriting the history. But in any case, the same thing happens in Ukraine as a way of, once you inculcate those people with a sense of independent nationalism, nationality, it sort of moves them away from Russia and the Soviet legacy, right? Because I said it necessarily has to be in opposition to those things. And then you start to get not just the sort of toxic nationality that I'm sure all the listeners have heard about in places like Azov, but then you get these states starting to align more with Western material interests. And so by 2014, you have, for example, ExxonMobil and Shell going to Ukraine to kind of scope out the prospects for developing oil and gas infrastructure, to trade it with Europe, to become a major trader with Europe. And you can imagine, for Russia, the second biggest petrostate in the world, whose economy is pegged on fossil fuel industry, that's a massive threat. But now you have a Ukrainian population who has been, again, inculcated with anti-Russianism, anti-Sovietism, who now you sort of have their support behind any Western-led endeavor that would threaten Russia's material interests. And so, again, these things, and you know, Brian would be able to say a lot more about Georgia. If you listen to his podcast, it's not just about Soviet Georgia, but he has a lot of people that talk about this stuff on there. But this nation building, this reconstruction of national memory is tied to the material transformations that happen. And that is precisely what we wanted to get at in our article, is to say, why are we just focusing on these essentialist national narratives about the place of khachapuri in Georgia, or borscht in Ukraine, or, some other, like, this Ukrainian nationalist writer is the embodiment of what it means to be Ukrainian. Like, who cares about that stuff? Let's be the Marxists that we are, and look at the material conditions that created the world that we live in right now. This is sort of where we were going.
But as you say in your piece, you talk about the fact that when you do stray away from the consensus narrative, which is being taught by more and more people, they're on the doctorate committees, that leaves you guys as outsiders.
Yeah.
It's going to be harder to get a job. It's going to be harder to get published. I mean, all jokes aside, Verso, Haymarket, all jokes aside, you're not making that much money, even if you are published on Verso. It's not Simon and Schuster, right? But you have to publish in academia, whether you're an adjunct or a department head. There's a reason why Jean Bajlan hasn't been on the show. There's a reason why it's hard to get Teray and Cedric on the show. These guys are professors, and they have to be writing. They have to be publishing. And the stuff that you guys aren't reading, trust me, it's not in Jacobin. It's academic journals. How hard is it then for you to publish, to write, to even keep a job when you go against orthodoxy like this?
I guess we'll find out. I mean, I will. Brian isn't currently in academia. He's an independent scholar, but I am, and I sort of occupy this weird middle place where, people who hate academics can hate me, even though I hate academics myself. And so I'm sort of in this weird spot where I'm in the middle. I'm not. I'm both an academic, but an anti-academic, and so I'm not friends with the people that hate academics because they hate me, and I'm also not friends with academics because I hate them. And so it's sort of in between. I wouldn't say that. It depends on where you're publishing. We talk about in our field, the cream of the crop in terms of publishing is academic presses, and you have to pitch your books to those academic press editors at places like ACES, at the conference. They're all there, and I went, for example, and I talked to the editor from University of Pittsburgh Press. It's a great press that publishes books on topics that are relevant to me, science and technology and environment. But challenging this sort of orthodoxy, it puts you in opposition to all of the members of the field who are like, those heavy hitters on Twitter, for example. So, Brian has something like, I don't know, over 1,000 followers, and I have a humble 200 on Twitter. And the people that will say negative things about us or our article, they're in like 32,000, 40,000. These are the big people that are on the news. These are writing journalist articles, and so they have a bigger soapbox than we do. And so their criticism can get further than our arguments can. And when that happens, you're sort of, you're at risk for somebody. If you're like me and you're actively on the job market trying to get tenure somewhere, somebody could run into you and be like, well, I saw this tweet that so-and-so had where they ripped your argument apart, and you're like, well, I never saw it. You know what I mean? I don't know what you're talking about.
Does that make you have to, and I'm sorry that we're kind of talking about this, but I do think it's important to the piece that you wrote, because it's all about this area of study, right? We're not just supposed to be here to talk about the history of the Soviet Union or contemporary Russia and its relationship to Ukraine. Does that then force you to have to be a little more active on social media?
I think maybe. So Brian is pretty active on social media. Me less so on Twitter. I'm pretty active on Instagram. But it's not, my Instagram isn't academic at all. I would purposely keep the things
Neither is
separate.
mine, which is why we can share memes.
Yeah, exactly. I keep the two separate so that I can shit talk freely on Instagram and it doesn't come back at me in any way. But in any case, on Twitter, I do, you know, I am active, but I'm not super active. I'm a humble amount of followers, and I've never quite interacted well with the interface of Twitter either. Mm-hmm. But it does have implications for, you know, the way that other scholars within our field and within history itself will kind of view us, right? Because now that this article is out, if they didn't already know, now it's obvious that we are Marxists, right? That we are Marxists within a field that thought, as of 1990, that Marxism is dead. Not just Marxism politically, but theoretical Marxism, materialism is dead. And what we're saying is, no, theoretically it did not die, or it shouldn't have anyway, and that the cultural turn that happened in the 90s was a political move to promote American hegemony, especially in the way that America cultivated national identities across post-Soviet space. And we want to go back. We want to sort of reverse that and say, well, let's get back to the materialism. And when it comes to like applying for grants, you know, a lot of these grant institutions are looking for places that also promote the American narrative, because, you know, a lot of the funding sources of certain institutes, I'm not going to name any because, again, I don't want to get in trouble by them, but the funding of not just these institutes, but ACES itself is endowed by, you know, the American State Department. Title VIII language grants that sends American scholars to the post-Soviet world is an American State Department grant. Fulbright is associated with the State Department, right? So all of these things are tied heavily to the United States. It thus cannot really challenge that dominant American narrative. And so when you do, and you apply for these grants, you're kind of viewed as straying too far away from it. And that's if you make it that far, right? If you apply for graduate school as a hyper Marxist and you know, your application is saying, I want to apply a material analysis to Menshevik Georgia, you might get laughed at. You know, your application won't be approved because they'll just say something like, oh, you know, materialism, Marxism is sort of an outdated historiographical trajectory. And so, you know, that kind of stuff happens. I'm not worried about my own ability to get published, because ultimately I'll find wherever I need to get something out if I think it's important enough, which is why I created the Substack. So if your listeners would like me to live in Mexico, please subscribe to the Substack so that I can live in Mexico and write my opinions that can offend everybody, free of.
Well, you know, I was talking about this with my good friend Bert Cooper, who somehow has managed to, I don't want to say infiltrate, but kind of infiltrate liberal circles. I mean, he gets to write for The Atlantic. He's published in the New York Times. He was on MSNBC. He's not my liberal friend, Bert. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And, you know, he goes, why do you think Ibrahim X. Kendi and these people get these MacArthur Genius Grants? There's nothing There's no socialist argument in how to be an anti-racist or stamp from the beginning. Nicole Hannah-Jones gets one as well for 1619. You know, what do you think these people get them? So I don't know. I think this is important. Someone says AMLO will welcome you. I don't know if you saw the AMLO stuff when we were leaving Mexico.
Yeah.
When you're going. So I also want to talk about this before we go. We're coming up on the hour. You actually mentioned in your piece the Soviet Union and its relationship to the civil rights movement. I was going to say Black Americans. Let's just say the civil rights movement. That's a history that definitely doesn't get taught in U.S. schools. And there's a handful of people that have talked about it through the years. Robin D.G. Kelly, I think Hammer to Hoe talks a little bit about that. Gerald Horne has definitely written about that. And Charisse Burton-Stelly has a new book that you actually cite in your piece that talks about the relationship between Black Americans and the Soviet Union. And you found some issue with people speaking at the conference, correct? About that relationship.
Yeah, that's right. There was a panel specifically on race in the Soviet Union. One of the panelists was Black, and she's a PhD candidate. Hasn't yet graduated. Who's somebody that, like, you know, Brian and I both follow on Twitter and have some level of respect for, but we have some fundamental disagreements with her, and so those disagreements really came up in this panel that Brian and I coincidentally were both at. You know, we didn't really go to the same panel.
Wait, you said you had a disagreement with Charisse, or you had a disagreement with someone else?
No, with this other scholar that was presenting a paper on Soviet views of American racism, and Angela Davis. And as she said in the beginning, she was using the analytical framework of Afro-pessimism to talk about it. And so if you go on our article, whether it's on Left East or on the Substack, you'll see an image of the Scottsboro persecutions that a Soviet artist made. And so one of the arguments in this panel was using that image, and she was pointing out the ways in which the Black men on the image are depicted. And, you know, they're depicted like pretty scary. Hold on, I have it up here. They're depicted pretty scary. You know, their faces are in silhouette. They look obviously distraught. And there's a lot of stereotypes of Blackness that are depicted in this image. And so her conclusion there was then to say, well, the Soviets were racist then.
But that's also, you know, sorry to cut you off, but that's kind of the same conclusion that Wilderson comes to in the Afro-pessimism. I don't remember if he says it in the book. I know he says it in an interview because he says he was a communist and he was in Soviet Russia for so long, and they made some comment about you're cool, but you can't get with my daughter, or some shit like that.
Yeah, but so from this sort of image of how a Soviet artist depicted Black men, she then inferred that the Soviet Union was a racist place. And, you know, she had mentioned that another way that it materialized was the way that the Soviet Union really focused on and spotlighted Angela Davis as a Black woman, right? A Black American woman. And so, you know, Angela Davis came to the Soviet Union. They made a big media fuss about it. Angela Davis spoke to the Soviet people and blah, blah, blah. And her argument, again, was that the way that they really focused on Angela Davis is, again, a reflection of Soviet racism. You know, and there was somebody in the crowd. It wasn't even Brian or I. Somebody in the crowd raised their hand and they were like, aren't you leaving out the fact that Angela Davis was a very active member of the CPUSA? That she was a member of the Communist Party of the United States. And that's why the Soviet people really focused on Angela Davis, not because of her race or her identity in that way. And so that, that was one argument that we agreed with and that we wanted to bring up. And the other one is, the scholar also referred to there's a case of a Black American who gets beat in the Soviet Union to death. But the scholar conveniently left out that it was Americans in the Soviet Union who beat this Black man, not Soviets that beat the Black man. And so again, like looking at these kind of essentialist narratives of culture through the eyes of Afro-pessimism, which is kind of an American-centric analytical framework, and applying that to the Soviet Union isn't an act of decolonization, right? You have to first work out a theoretical framework of race in the Soviet Union to talk about how the Soviets viewed race. You can't just take American race relations and then try to apply them to the Soviet Union, because it's a different context. And we're not saying that people in the Soviet Union weren't racist. Sure, they no doubt are. I mean, you see it. You go to Russia today and you can hear how certain people talk about people from Uzbekistan and stuff like that. The racism is definitely there. But again, it's a different theoretical framework that needs to be worked out, not just, let's import this American framework and try to understand it in the Soviet context. And so that's what we were really railing against in this article. And that's what we really found faulty with this, with the analysis itself. And so again, going back to that poster of the Scottsboro prisoners, to say that the Soviet Union was racist based on this photo is based on this picture is missing the point that the artist was trying to depict how Americans viewed Black men, not how he or Soviet people viewed Black men, but the ways in which Americans viewed Black men. So it's missing that point, that this poster was fundamentally a criticism of the United States and American race relations. It wasn't reifying American racial tropes, if that makes sense.
Oh, it makes total sense. And it kind of speaks. This is the reason why I wanted to bring that up in the article, is that there's so much projection of American politics onto not yours, but people's theories on the Soviet Union, how they viewed race. And it's just not how you look at history. But then again, there's a reason why we call ourselves Marxists. And it's not because we get cool t-shirts. We have a super chat from JB. I want to read this out loud to you. Excellent episode tonight. Alex is great.
Thanks, JB. If you really think I'm great, subscribe to that Substack.
Look at you. Look at you. Just like a salesman. He's not a real Marxist.
I'm trying to live in Mexico, and it's fucking right.
I think the guy next door to me moved out, to be totally honest with you. I think the cat next door to me is gone, and they just built a new bathroom. So you would have a bigger place than mine with 2 bathrooms and a sunroom.
I don't think I could live next to you.
Why?
We would just bro out all the time.
You'd be like, Ben Burgess lived down here, and all he did was once I told him that the door, the breezeway door to the patio was open, he would just go with his dog and walk on the patio and just write.
Yeah. I mean, I would show up at your door knocking, and with like some dumb excuse in my underwear, just be like, "You got any flour?" You're like, "No.
Again,
I don't have flour."
Ben came over, and I have a very, if you know me, you stayed here, I don't lock the door. So it's like, just knock and say you're coming in, and fucking, how to work the TV.
Hell yeah, that's true. I wouldn't have to pay for. I just use your internet too. I don't have to pay for shit.
Oh, you'd be one of them cats.
If I'm on your IP address, then I can share your Netflix account too.
I canceled all that shit since you guys came.
Oh, that's good.
I'm trying to.
I don't have Netflix either. I kind of want to. So I want to watch the Dave Chappelle special, but I also want to watch there's a new like series on World War II that some historian friends of mine have vouched for. So kind of curious about that.
Side note, Adam Curtis has a new documentary that hit the States. It came out last year in the BBC. 2 years ago? 2 years ago in the BBC. I didn't see it until recently. It's on YouTube now. I think a new thing about Soviet Russia.
Oh, cool. I'll have to look that up.
I think it's kind of a deeper take on hypernormalization. You know, kind of to me, a lot of his thesis is like everything sucked in the Soviet
Union. Which is untrue.
There you go. Yeah, that's Curtis's take right there.
Untrue, but
trauma zone, yeah.
No, of course things suck. You know, it's sort of like, I don't know how many of your listeners have kids, but I know you do. Mm-hmm. And so you know that like your kids are harder on you than they are on anybody else. And it's because they love you the most. So people are more critical of their home country because they're the most comfortable with it. They know it the best. And so when you meet like, you know, Russians who live in the US who really hate the United States, I'm not saying it's because they love Russia or whatever, but it's because they know it best. It's the same reason why Americans are hypercritical of the US. We're supposed to be. It's unfortunately our country, you know? And so how that position, you know, most of them moved here in the 1980s or 1990s in terrible, terrible economic conditions. When they moved here, that cultural memory, that economic memory of how they were living in the 80s and 90s, that's what they brought with them. And so they look back at life in the Soviet Union like, oh, it was terrible. Yeah, it was in the 80s. And it was because economic reforms were going really poorly. It was in the 90s because privatization was a disaster. But if you poll anybody that was alive in the Brezhnev period, for example, all the statistics show that that was the height of standards of living in the Soviet Union. People were happy under Brezhnev. So, you know, the whole like Soviet Union was a terrible place to live. I don't fully buy it.
I mean, I gotta watch it, but it definitely. He always talks a lot about the years up into the fall, so the mid '80s to the early '90s, right? He always kind of talks about that time. The book or the movie Hypernormalization is based off a book. I've only read the intro to the book, but it's interesting, you know, kind of talking about that time frame. That Gorbachev time frame basically is what he's talking about, the Gorbachev years, and you know, different levels of poverty, and it is one of those, you know, using found footage, and I've only seen about 25 minutes of it. I haven't got a chance to really sit down and soak it in as I've been working on some other stuff, and I can't actually have fun. You know how that is, right?
Brezhnev also had fucking massively sexy eyebrows. I'm sort of jealous of them.
Well, look, if anybody wants to read Alex and Brian's piece, there's definitely links in the chat. There's definitely a link in the description to the piece. Sign up for a Substack. I have signed up for a Substack. I'm going to the champagne room with the rest of the patrons. We're going to be talking about the Cat Williams and Shannon Sharpe interview. It is definitely conversation and giggle worthy. Toussaint will be joining us in the champagne room. Alex, you're going to sleep, or are you joining us?
I could join you. I haven't watched the Cat Williams thing, but if you're playing clips from it, I'd love to see
it. You know I'm playing clips from it.
Let me
playing clips. Yeah. Do your thing. I got to sign off. Thank you guys so much. If you would like to watch this champagne room, there is one easy way. Become a patron for as little as $3 a month. $30 for the year. You can have access to champagne rooms past and present. Join us for movie nights. It's all yours. Also, you make sure that we can continue to give you this kind of programming at least 3 nights a week. More often than not, 4 nights a week. It's been really hard to get 4 nights a week. Oh, and don't forget to listen to, because Alex is sending me messages right now, Brian's podcast, Reimagining Soviet Georgia. So I want to check that out. So we're going to try to get Brian back on. Maybe a weekend is easier since he is in an entirely different country. That always makes it harder. But thank you guys so much. I will see you in the champagne room, and we are out.